What is up, YouTube? This is your host, Ranee B, here to spill that homicidal tea. In today's case that we are going to be covering, it's going to take us all the way over to Ozark, Alabama. What kind of tea do you think that they spill in those parts? Incompetent blend, that's for sure. Now, my homicidal besties tell me, do you have any idea how many of these cases are completely destroying people's lives because of this awful police work? I mean, the more I research it, the more I'm amazed at how much pressure is put on these police officers to close these cases, despite completely innocent people being hounded and pursued by these investigators, resulting in their lives changed forever. Before we get into it, let me remind you to beat the hell out of that like and subscribe button, like someone should smash these people that hide facts from these investigators. Like people in this case, the case of Tracy Harris. Now, I'd also like to take this opportunity to apologize for the last couple of videos. I had COVID. Oh my God, I had no idea. I was supposed to go out of town to see an old friend. Shout out Michael Smith. Woo! I was absolutely so excited. But just in case the night before I took a COVID test, just positive. I had no symptoms except just a little bit of a stuffy nose, which you could hear in those videos. So that's why I'm apologizing, because I'm talking like this. It was awful. So whenever I was editing those, I was like, oh gosh. But I hadn't put up content in so long. So I was just like, well, here goes nothing. But anyway, I'm back and all better, as you can tell. Hooray! So let's get back to the case. Wait, we haven't even started yet. Let's get to the case of Tracy Harris. On Wednesday, March 7th, 1990, Tracy Harris, a resident of Ozark, Alabama, was reported missing by her husband, Carl Harris. Tracy Harris was a 22-year-old mother of 4-year-old Carolyn. So for her just to up and vanish, it was not something that was in her character. Just 1 week later, they found her body in the Choctawhatchee River just a few miles from her house. The autopsy revealed that Tracy's lungs had water and sand in them, indicating that she had drowned. But there were scars and bruises that were found around her neck that were symptomatic of strangling, leading the medical examiner to rule that her death was a homicide. You can always rely on that good old hyoid bone to do the talking for the victims. That and petechial hemorrhages. It is so funny what we learn from watching crime shows, isn't it? Ugh. Anyway, well, Tracy had been known to frequent this area near the river where her body was discovered. She enjoyed getting together with friends there and just hanging out. Now, Tracy lived with her husband because they were actually divorced, but they were trying to get back together, but we'll get to that. His name is Carl Harris, and their 4-year-old daughter, Carolyn, at the time of her abduction and murder. Carl was questioned by the cops, and he told them that he and Tracy began dating when Tracy was approximately 16 years old and Carl was 19. They married when she was a senior, and she became pregnant. So now the marriage, it didn't last long, though, as Carl and Tracy divorced soon after. But as parents often do, they tried to reconcile to make things work for little Carolyn. Carl was seeing a 17-year-old girl at the time of Tracy's disappearance, which led police officers to assume that he was involved in Tracy's death. From interactions with people who knew Tracy and Carl, police found that Carl had talked to his girlfriend about marrying her, and others had claimed that he told them that he wanted to get married to his girlfriend as well, but he was unable to because it would anger Tracy and make her go file for child support. Motive what? All of this talk, it put Carl as suspect numero uno, and which is typical in these murder cases. And unfortunately, it turns out that the spouse is usually the perpetrator. But as investigators dug into Carl, they couldn't find any evidence of foul play when they examined the residence. Carl was also accommodating and polite to police officers when they came to search his residence. Something else, though, was not in Carl's favor. That was the fact that he was the last person to have seen Tracy. That's never good. He picked her up after work on March 7th at the restaurant where she was a waitress. And then he had claimed that he dropped her off at the house immediately and gone straight to work because he had a shift that night at the grocery store down the street. During the course of the investigation, detectives met with a number of people who knew Carl and Tracy, and several of them had stated that Carl was abusive. And even though this was what people were saying, when confronted with this, Carl denied that he'd ever been abusive to Tracy, keeping the same story throughout the investigation. Tracy never reported anything on the alleged assaults either to the police, and there was no official record of any domestic violence. Unfortunately, though, victims sometimes don't report their abuse to the authorities, and police could not ignore the fact that they had 14 statements from people who claimed to have witnessed the abuse firsthand. Enter Jeff and Dawn Beasley. For about a month, Jeff Beasley and his future wife, Dawn Beasley, resided with Carl and Tracy. Jeff worked with Carl at the grocery store, and when Carl heard that his buddy and his soon-to-be wife needed a place to live, Carl asked Tracy if it was okay if they stayed with them, and immediately Carl and Tracy opened their home to them and provided them a place to stay. Dawn and Tracy became fast friends, having a lot in common since Tracy was still a new mom somewhat at the time, and Dawn was expecting her first child, so they had a lot of common ground and they could swap stories on parenting advice. Dawn claimed that while living with them, that she had seen a side of Carl that she didn't like, and he was regarded by her as a domineering man, and that he was really controlling, and he wouldn't let her have friends outside of the home. He was verbally abusive. Dawn also informed authorities that she had seen physical violence as well. Carl allegedly flew into a frenzy when Tracy requested money to pay bills, and according to her, Carl had Tracy bent over backwards with his hands around her throat, nearly suffocating her. Despite the fact the authorities had named Carl as their main suspect, and he did have motive for killing Tracy, they decided not to bring charges because they lacked sufficient evidence. That's when the case went cold. With all the rumors flying around Ozark that Carl was to blame for Tracy's murder, Tracy's mother adopted Carolyn, and the two relocated to Texas. Carolyn returned to Ozark only in 2015. Remember, this took place in 1990, after her grandmother passed away, to bury her next to Tracy. She spoke with the Ozark Police Department while she was there, and the case was reopened. The Ozark Police Department's cold case team started investigating it again, and they determined that they were going to bring Tracy's killer to justice, and they knew all the major players and who the suspect was. All they had to do was make sure that they had enough evidence to establish it and get a conviction. Sometimes when a case isn't so raw and fresh, people have a way of just being more forward with their statements, and they're not as afraid to talk to authorities. At least that's what happens on Cold Justice. Anyway, when the new cold case team examined the evidence in the file, they concluded that they already had enough evidence that was sufficient to take to the district attorney and to get the green light to file charges. They believed their evidence was strong enough to gain a conviction, despite the fact that this case was mostly circumstantial. Carl and his girlfriend split up after Tracy's death, and he left Ozark. He changed employment a few times and met a lady and had another daughter. He was discovered in South Carolina by police, who arrested him and charged him with her murder. Despite the fact that prosecution thought that they had a solid case, Carl was adamant at pleading not guilty. He said he was not involved whatsoever in Tracy's death. It just didn't look that way on paper, though. The prosecution's case began to develop prior to this trial. Carl left his job at the store where he worked at approximately 9 p.m. on March 7, 1990. Now, according to their story, that's when Carl strangled Tracy to death inside their house after a violent confrontation occurred when he returned home. He then loaded her in his car and drove to the Choctawhatchee River, where he flung her over the side of the guardrails and into the river. Tracy would have been still alive, even if only barely, at the time, according to their theory, and that explains why sand and water was discovered in her lungs. They also thought that Carl had picked up a companion around 9:30 p.m. named Bobby Herring. At this time, Carl's defense team went public, declaring that the prosecution's case was entirely fabricated and was motivated actually not by finding justice, but by their desperation to close their case. Strong words. They stated that Carl would not have time to kill Tracy and dump her body. The defense actually instead pointed the finger at Bobby Herring. He was found guilty of sexually assaulting a lady prior to this, and the defense argued that he was maybe to blame for Tracy's murder. The prosecution was finalizing its case and looking through the witness testimonies and planning on what questions they wanted to ask various witnesses. Just before the trial was about to begin, they intended to leave no question in the jury's mind that Carl was a violent and abusive man and had verbally and physically abused Tracy, and that he had enough reason to want Tracy out of his life, and he had the ability to do so. Jordan Davis, an assistant district attorney, saw something in the prosecution's file that she felt would strengthen their case. And you see, Dawn Beasley had provided police with a statement in connection with the violent event that she saw, that she said she'd witnessed, in which Carl had actually placed his hands around Tracy's throat. Jordan believed that this information was critical for the jury to hear, since it was similar to what occurred to Tracy on March 7th. They wanted to establish that Carl had done it previously and that he could have easily done it again on March 7th. The only difference was this time the ramifications were much worse. Jordan contacted Dawn and asked if she would testify on the prosecution's behalf. Dawn turned down the offer. Jordan, on the other hand, would not take no for an answer. Dawn was served a subpoena, and that required her to testify or be punished. Dawn was enraged, calling Jordan and screaming about how she was going to ruin her life and she was going to wreck it. And she ultimately revealed her reason not to testify. She informed prosecution that they were about to convict a man who was completely innocent. Jordan demanded an explanation from her, and Dawn told Jordan that she was now divorced, but when she lived with Carl and Tracy, she was planning to marry a man named Jeff Beasley, which she did later on. Dawn said that she knew that Carl was an innocent man because Jeff woke her up in the middle of the night on the night of March 7th, 1990, and informed her that he had killed Tracy. The prosecution was taken aback by such a claim. Jeff was never even a suspect, and no one even spoke to him or took a statement after Tracy's death, despite the fact that he lived with them and despite the fact that he had a criminal record, including burglary and attempted escapes. Dawn claimed that Jeff woke her up in the middle of the night and informed her that he had inadvertently hurt Tracy and that she died. Oops, hate it when that happens. Dawn inquired as to what had occurred, and he said that he had gone to the house because he needed to talk to Carl. Carl wasn't there. He talked to Tracy, who was alone at home at the time, and said that he thought that she should leave Carl. According to Dawn, Jeff said that when he came to her with that information, Tracy became enraged and that they fought, and as a result, he accidentally fatally injured her. Oops. Dawn informed Jordan that Jeff dropped Tracy's corpse into the river because he didn't want anybody to find her. Public river, okay, anyway. Dawn had maintained that secret for more than 2 decades, even after Jeff was in prison in 1991 for burglary and served 5 years in prison. She waited for him on the outside and didn't tell anybody what he had done. Ride or die, I guess. Whatever. Brittany Vaughn talks about this. If you're in prison for more than a couple days, I'm out. Dude, I agree. If you're going to kill somebody, you're going to tell me about it, guess what? I'm telling. So don't come tell me because I'm going to snitch. Snitch on you. Anyway, back to the story, sorry. But she waited for him on the outside, like I said, and she didn't tell anybody, but she said she was acting on the best interests of their 4 children. Yeah, that's great. Protect a murderer. Jeff was approached by the investigators as he was still living in Ozark, and Jeff denied killing Tracy and consented to take a polygraph examination, which he failed. Despite this, he maintained his innocence. This carried on for several hours until finally, after repeated investigators hammering on him, he finally cracked, and he told them that he would tell them the truth. He admitted to killing Tracy, saying that they were having an affair. They went down to the river that night of March 7th just to hang out, and Tracy promised him that she would leave Carl so they could be together. But Jeff refused to leave Dawn and informed Tracy he would not leave her. This sparked a huge fight, and they were wading in the river at the time, according to Jeff. And then she fell down and she didn't get back up. I mean, are you serious? Can you guys come? I mean, he had 2 decades to come up with a good story. Seriously. Police officers asked him what had caused the marks on her neck, and he said that, well, I didn't suffocate her, but I do recall grabbing her and submerging her into the river. Shut up! Oh my gosh, anyway. It matched what the autopsy said, regardless. Dawn's description of the confession differed from Jeff's, and Dawn told Jordan that they had a fight, Tracy was murdered at her house, but in addition, police were unable to find any evidence to support that allegation. Nobody thought they were having an affair. Nobody, even including Dawn herself, said it was highly unlikely they were having an affair. There was also one piece of information that the prosecution could never figure out, and actually never did. The name Beasley was spray painted in large letters near the river where her body was discovered. It was present even before Jeff was ever interrogated. They couldn't understand why. They have no idea why it was spray painted there or who did it. No one knew who ever did the graffiti, but nevertheless, Jeff was charged with Tracy's murder. Carl's murder accusation was dropped one day before his trial was about to begin. Jeff pled guilty and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. In August of 2021, Carl filed a lawsuit against the city of Ozark claiming damages. He insisted that he never mistreated Tracy, and according to the lawsuit, police provided forged documentation and evidence, and damages should be result in the amount of $6 million. That's what he was seeking in that lawsuit. The lawsuit also wanted damages for false detention, as well as pain and suffering. And you might be wondering, what kind of, pain and suffering there was? What the Ozark Police Department's cold case squad did to Carl's life with inadequate evidence is simply horrible. All of this could have been averted if they had made one phone call or they interviewed more witnesses. Carl Harris has lost employment, been evicted from houses, missed funerals for family members, and spent time in prison, all because his case wasn't thoroughly investigated. Now, that's not even the worst of it. Carl lost out on having a bond with Carolyn, his daughter. After Tracy's death, authorities withdrew her from his custody and her grandmother adopted her, and she never saw Carl again in her childhood. She grew up believing that her father had killed her mother. And Bobby Herring, the man that also was the alternate suspect cited by the defense, he didn't have anything to do with Tracy's death whatsoever. But again, just like in sweet little Heather Bogle's case, look at what effect that this shit police work had on so many people's lives. Like, Carl and Carolyn will never be able to get back that time that they had with them together. Both of them were victims, losing Tracy. And what the hell, Dawn? She should be as accountable as Jeff. I think at least obstruction of justice or something. Death penalty, absolutely, killer. And who wrote Beasley on that bridge? Maybe the Pollock twins. So crazy. But, what do you guys think? I sure hope Carl gets that settlement. Money can't buy happiness, but I remember a long time ago on Shark Tank, I saw Mark Cuban. He said something along the lines, money doesn't buy happiness, but it can buy you a jet ski, and I've never seen an unhappy person on a jet ski. Anyway. I know none of this is really funny, but seriously, I hope he does. I hope he gets a shit ton of money. I want to be on that jury. I want to move. I don't know where they are. Oh yeah, Alabama. I don't know if I like Alabama, but I'll pretend to be an Alabama person just so I can be on that jury.
That's one of the reasons we like it. The people here are great.
That's all for this case, but until next time, you stay on the straight and narrow, my inquisitive little cuties. And Merry Christmas if I don't see you. And there's going to be a new video real soon. I've got a lot in the hopper, and I don't sound like I have COVID anymore because I don't. Yay! So until next time, I will see you real soon in the next video.